Eleanor Hartwell's breath caught in her throat as she unfolded the yellowed pages she had discovered hidden beneath the floorboards of her late grandmother's Montana homestead, pages filled with elegant handwriting that described a woman who could only be her. The year was 1885, and the autumn wind rattled the windows of the old house as she read words written by someone named James Cordell, a cowboy who had apparently loved her from afar for 2 decades, chronicling every moment he had ever seen her, every smile, every gesture, as though she were the sun around which his entire world orbited. Her hands trembled as she realized these diary entries began in 1865, when she would have been merely a child of 5 years old, and continued through the years, describing her growth, her laughter, her kindness to strangers in town, and most peculiarly directions to a hidden cabin in the mountains where he had retreated to live in solitude. Eleanor was now 25 years old, unmarried, despite the constant pressure from her family to settle down with one of the respectable merchants or ranchers in the growing town of Helena. She had always felt that something was missing, that there was a connection she had not yet found. And now these pages seemed to offer an explanation for the restlessness that had plagued her entire adult life. The handwriting was beautiful, almost artistic, and the words themselves were poetry, describing her chestnut hair that caught the sunlight, her green eyes that sparkled with intelligence, and her compassionate nature that made her stop to help anyone in need. She had no memory of this James Cordell, no recollection of a cowboy who had watched her with such devotion, yet the details were too specific, too accurate to be the work of a madman or a stranger. Her grandmother had passed away 3 months earlier, leaving Eleanor the homestead and all its contents, but she had said nothing about hidden diary pages or a mysterious cowboy who had loved her granddaughter for 20 years. Eleanor's parents had died in a wagon accident when she was 15. And her grandmother had raised her through those difficult years, teaching her to be strong and independent. Now, sitting in the dim light of the oil lamp, Eleanor made a decision that would change her life forever. She would find this hidden cabin, confront this James Cordell, and demand to know why he had spent 2 decades writing about her without ever approaching her directly. The diary pages included detailed descriptions of the route to the cabin, mentioning landmarks like the split pine tree near Copper Creek, the red rock formation that resembled a sleeping bear, and the narrow trail that wound up through the aspens to a hidden valley. Eleanor spent the next 2 days preparing for the journey, packing supplies, saddling her mare Duchess, and telling her closest friend Martha that she would be gone for at least a week. Martha tried to dissuade her, warning that the mountains could be dangerous for a woman traveling alone, but Eleanor was determined. She had lived her entire life following the rules, being the proper young lady that society expected, and now she needed answers more than she needed safety. The journey began on a crisp October morning, with frost still clinging to the grass and her breath visible in the cold air. Eleanor followed the directions carefully, finding the split pine tree exactly where the diary had indicated, then following Copper Creek upstream for several miles. The landscape was breathtaking, with golden aspens shimmering against the deep blue sky and elk bugling in the distance. She camped the first night beside the creek, building a small fire and reading through the diary pages again by firelight. The entries were dated sporadically, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes months, but they all carried the same tone of longing and devotion. One entry from 1870 described the day Eleanor had helped an elderly woman carry her groceries through the muddy streets of Helena, her dress getting soaked but her smile never fading. Another from 1875 recounted the moment she had defended a Chinese railroad worker from harassment by drunken miners, standing up to men twice her size with a courage that had left James breathless. He wrote about watching her from distances, always careful never to intrude, never to make her uncomfortable, but unable to stay away completely. He described himself as unworthy, a simple cowboy with nothing to offer someone as remarkable as her, yet unable to stop his heart from claiming her as his own. On the second day, Eleanor found the red rock formation and felt her pulse quicken with anticipation and nervousness. What would she say when she finally met this man? What if he was dangerous, despite the gentle words in his diary? What if he was nothing like the person his writing suggested? She pressed forward, following the narrow trail through the aspens as the terrain grew steeper and more rugged. Duchess picked her way carefully over the rocky ground, and Eleanor leaned forward in the saddle, scanning the valley ahead for any sign of a cabin. As the sun began to descend toward the western peaks, she saw it. Nestled in a hidden valley surrounded by towering pines and aspens, a small log cabin stood beside a clear stream, smoke rising from its chimney. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she guided Duchess down the final slope, her mind racing with 1,000 questions and scenarios. The cabin was well maintained, with a small corral holding 2 horses, a vegetable garden that had been harvested for the season, and stacks of firewood neatly arranged under a covered shelter. This was not the home of a madman or a recluse who had lost touch with reality. This was the home of someone who valued order and self-sufficiency. Eleanor dismounted near the corral, tying Duchess securely before approaching the cabin on foot. She could hear sounds from inside, the clatter of dishes and the scrape of a chair against the wooden floor. She raised her hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of how completely she had upended her normal life to chase this mystery. Before she could second-guess herself further, the door opened, and she found herself face to face with James Cordell. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-40s, with sun-weathered skin and dark hair streaked with gray at the temples. His eyes were a striking blue, and they widened with shock and something that looked like fear when he saw her standing on his porch. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, and Eleanor watched a series of emotions cross his face: surprise, recognition, wonder, and finally resignation. He knew why she was here. He had been expecting this day, perhaps dreading it, for 20 years. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said quietly, his voice rough from years of solitude. "I knew you would find them eventually. Your grandmother promised me she would keep them hidden, but I suppose she wanted you to know the truth after she was gone." "You know my grandmother?" Eleanor asked, finding her voice despite the surreal nature of the situation. She knew about these diary pages, about you watching me all these years. James stepped back, gesturing for her to enter the cabin. "Come inside. You have ridden a long way, and you deserve answers. I will tell you everything, though I suspect you will think me either a fool or something worse when you hear the whole story." The cabin interior was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture, shelves lined with books, and a stone fireplace that radiated warmth. Eleanor noticed details that spoke of a man who lived deliberately and thoughtfully. Wildflowers in a glass jar on the table, sketches pinned to the walls, and a violin resting in the corner. James poured her a cup of coffee from a pot on the stove, then sat down across from her, his hands wrapped around his own cup as though seeking comfort from its warmth. "I met your grandmother in 1864, he began, his eyes distant with memory. "I was 24 years old, working as a ranch hand near Helena. She hired me to help repair her barn after a storm, and during that week, I met you. You were 4 years old, running through the yard chasing butterflies, laughing with a joy so pure it made something in my chest ache. I had never believed in love at first sight, and certainly not with a child. But there was something about you, Eleanor. Even then, I could see the person you would become, the kindness, the strength, the light that shone from within you." Eleanor listened, her coffee forgotten as she tried to reconcile the man before her with the words she had read in his diary. "You fell in love with a 4-year-old child? That is disturbing, James. Surely you can understand why this troubles me." "No," he said firmly, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I did not fall in love with a child. I saw a soul. Eleanor, I saw the woman you would become, and I knew with absolute certainty that when you grew up, when you became that woman, I would love you with everything I had, but I also knew I had no right to interfere with your life, no right to influence or shape you in any way. So I made a choice. I would watch from a distance, I would document the moments I was blessed to witness, and I would wait. If you never found the pages, if you never came looking for me, then my love would remain my own burden to carry. But if you did find them, if you did come here, then perhaps fate had decided that my 20 years of devotion meant something." You waited 20 years, Eleanor repeated, struggling to comprehend such patience, such dedication. You never married, never courted anyone else, never tried to live a normal life. Why? Why would you do something so extraordinary, so completely impractical? James set down his coffee cup and leaned forward, his eyes never leaving hers. Because the moment I saw you, even as that laughing child, I knew that settling for anything less than what I felt would be a betrayal of the deepest truth I had ever known. I am not asking you to understand it, Eleanor. I'm not even asking you to return my feelings. I'm simply telling you the truth. I have loved you for 20 years, from a distance, without expectation, without demand. I documented my feelings in those pages because writing was the only way I could express what I felt without burdening you with it. Eleanor stood and walked to the window, looking out at the valley bathed in the golden light of sunset. Her mind was reeling, trying to process everything she had learned. A part of her wanted to be angry, to call this obsession or something unhealthy, but the words in his diary had been so gentle, so respectful. He had never tried to control her life or insert himself into it. He had simply loved her from afar, celebrating her triumphs and aching for her sorrows, asking nothing in return. My grandmother knew all of this, she said, more a statement than a question. She did, James confirmed. When your parents died, I wrote to her, offering my condolences and asking if there was anything I could do to help. She invited me to visit, and we had a long conversation about my feelings for you. She was protective, as she should have been, but she also saw that my intentions were honorable. She told me that if I was truly serious about loving you, I needed to make something of myself, to become a man worthy of you. So I worked. I saved every penny I earned as a cowboy, invested in some mining claims that paid off, and eventually built this cabin as a refuge. Your grandmother knew where I was. She would send me occasional letters telling me how you were doing, especially after your parents passed. She never betrayed your privacy or shared anything too personal, but she gave me enough to know that you were safe and growing into the remarkable woman I had always believed you would become. Eleanor turned back to face him, tears glistening in her eyes. She left me those diary pages deliberately. She hid them where she knew I would eventually find them when I was repairing the floor. This was her intention all along. Your grandmother was a wise woman, James said softly. She told me once that if my love was real, truly real, then it would find a way. She believed in destiny, in the idea that some connections are forged by something greater than ourselves. I think she wanted to give us a chance, but only when you were old enough to make your own choice, free from any pressure or obligation. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire. Eleanor felt as though she stood at a crossroads, with her entire future depending on what she decided in this moment. She could dismiss this as the delusion of a lonely man, mount her horse, and return to Helena, returning to her ordinary life. Or she could take a leap of faith into the unknown, trusting in the words she had read and the sincerity she saw in James Cordell's eyes. Tell me about yourself, she said finally, returning to her seat. Not about your feelings for me, but about who you are. What do you do with your days? What do you dream about? What makes you laugh? James seemed surprised by the question, but a small smile touched his lips. I raise horses. Those 2 in the corral are mine, and I have 3 more that I sold to a ranch in Bozeman last month. I breed them for intelligence and temperament, not just speed or strength. I read constantly, everything from philosophy to adventure novels. I taught myself to play the violin through a mail-order instruction book. Though I am not particularly good at it, I write, obviously, though mostly in my diary. I sketch sometimes, trying to capture the beauty of this valley. I help the neighboring ranchers when they need an extra hand, and they help me in return. I am not a hermit, Eleanor. I am simply a man who chose to live deliberately away from the noise and chaos of town, waiting for the one thing that mattered most to me. Show me your sketches, Eleanor requested, surprising herself with the words. James rose and retrieved a leather portfolio from a shelf, handing it to her with an almost shy expression. Eleanor opened it and found herself looking at dozens of drawings, each one more skilled than the last. There were landscapes of the valley in different seasons, studies of horses and wildlife, and then, scattered throughout, sketches of her. He had drawn her from memory, capturing moments he had witnessed over the years. Eleanor at 15, her face set with determination as she carried water buckets. Eleanor at 18, laughing with friends outside the general store. Eleanor at 22, her expression thoughtful as she read a book on a bench. The drawings were not idealized or romanticized. They were honest, capturing both her strengths and her vulnerabilities. And Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks as she realized how carefully he had observed her, how deeply he had tried to understand her. "These are beautiful," she whispered. "You have real talent, James." "I drew what inspired me," he said simply. "You have always inspired me, Eleanor, not just your appearance, though you are lovely, but the way you move through the world with grace and kindness, the way you stand up for those who cannot stand up for themselves, the way you find joy in simple things. Those are the qualities I tried to capture." Eleanor closed the portfolio and looked at him. Really looked at him, seeing past her initial shock and confusion to the man underneath. He was handsome in a rugged, weathered way. But more than that, he was genuine. There was no artifice in his words or his manner, no attempt to manipulate or seduce. He had laid his heart bare before her, offering his truth without expectation, and that vulnerability touched something deep within her. "I do not know what to feel," she admitted. "Part of me is overwhelmed by all of this. Part of me is touched beyond words. And part of me is angry that you never gave me the chance to know you before now. What if I had met you 5 years ago or 10? What if we could have had that time together?" "I thought about that constantly," James said, his voice rough with emotion. "I questioned my decision 1,000 times, but I was always afraid that if I approached you before you were ready, before you knew your own mind completely, I would be influencing your feelings rather than earning them. I wanted you to choose me freely, Eleanor, if you chose me at all. I wanted you to come to me, not the other way around. And now I am here," Eleanor said. "I rode for 2 days to find you because those diary pages moved me in a way I cannot fully explain. I have had suitors, James, men who were more suitable on paper, men my family approved of, but I always felt that something was missing. I thought perhaps I was too particular, too romantic in my expectations. But reading your words, seeing how you loved me without asking anything in return, I realized what was missing. None of them saw me the way you do. None of them understood me the way your words suggest you do." James stood and moved to the fireplace, gripping the mantel as though he needed something solid to anchor himself. "I will not pressure you, Eleanor. You can stay in the cabin tonight, and I will sleep in the barn. Tomorrow, if you wish to return to Helena, I will escort you part of the way to ensure your safety. If you want to take the diary pages and burn them, I will understand. If you want to forget you ever found this place, I will respect that. But if you want to stay, if you want to give us a chance to truly know each other, then I will spend every remaining day of my life trying to be worthy of the gift of your presence." Eleanor rose and walked to him, her heart pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. She reached out and touched his arm, feeling the solid warmth of him beneath her fingers. "I am not ready to say I love you, James. That would be dishonest. But I'm ready to say that I want to know you. I want to understand the man who wrote those beautiful words. I want to see if what you felt from a distance can translate into something real between us. Will you give me that time? Will you be patient a little longer?" James turned to face her, and she saw tears shining in his blue eyes. "I have waited 20 years, Eleanor. I can wait as long as you need. Stay for a week, a month, however long feels right. Let me show you who I am. Let me learn who you are beyond what I have observed from afar. And if, at the end of that time, you decide this is not what you want, I will let you go without complaint." Eleanor spent the next 3 weeks at the cabin, and they were the most transformative weeks of her life. James was a perfect gentleman, giving her the bedroom while he slept on a bedroll near the fire. They spent their days working side by side, tending his horses, repairing fence lines, and gathering the last of the autumn harvest from his garden. They talked for hours, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. James told her about growing up on a failing farm in Kansas, about coming west after his parents died, about the loneliness that had marked most of his adult life. Eleanor shared her own stories about the pain of losing her parents, about her grandmother's strength and wisdom, about the pressure she had felt to marry someone appropriate rather than someone who truly understood her. In the evenings, James would play his violin, the notes sometimes hesitant but always heartfelt, and Eleanor would read aloud from his collection of books. They debated philosophy and politics, discovering that they agreed on most things but that their occasional disagreements led to stimulating conversations rather than arguments. James taught her to sketch, guiding her hand as she attempted to capture the beauty of the valley, and Eleanor taught him a card game her grandmother had loved. They laughed together, worked together, and slowly, inevitably, fell in love. It was not the instant, overwhelming passion of dime novels. It was something deeper and more enduring, built on genuine understanding and respect. Eleanor found herself watching James when he did not realize it, admiring the way he moved with quiet confidence, the way he spoke gently to his horses, the way his face lit up when he made her laugh. She noticed small things. The scar on his left hand from a knife accident, the way he always made sure she had the warmest blanket, the care he took in preparing meals they could share. And she realized that what he had written in his diary was true. He had seen her, really seen her, in a way no one else ever had. On a cold November evening, as they sat before the fire after dinner, Eleanor finally spoke the words that had been building in her heart. "I love you, James. I do not know exactly when it happened, whether it was when you showed me your sketches, or when you taught me to ride your favorite horse, or when you held me while I cried about missing my grandmother, but I love you, and I want to build a life with you here in this valley or wherever we decide to go." James set down the cup he had been holding and turned to her, his eyes shining with emotion. "Eleanor, I have dreamed of hearing you say those words for 20 years, but now that I have, I find myself almost afraid to believe they are real. Are you certain? Are you sure this is not just the romance of this place, the isolation from your normal life? I could not bear it if you regretted this choice." Eleanor moved closer to him, taking his weathered hands in hers. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life. What we have built over these past weeks is real, James. It is based on honesty and genuine connection. You are not the fantasy I might have imagined when I read your diary. You are better. You are real, with flaws and doubts and fears, and I love all of it. I love you for who you are, not for who I imagined you might be." James pulled her into his arms, holding her as though she were something precious and fragile. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this decision. I will love you, honor you, and cherish you every single day. You are the answer to every prayer I never dared to speak aloud." They were married in Helena a month later, in a simple ceremony attended by Martha and a few other close friends. Eleanor wore her grandmother's wedding dress, altered to fit her, and James wore a new suit that made him look both handsome and uncomfortable. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with a tenderness that made several guests dab at their eyes with handkerchiefs. They returned to the cabin for the winter, and Eleanor discovered that life in the hidden valley was both challenging and rewarding. The snow came early and deep, isolating them completely for weeks at a time, but she found she did not mind the solitude. She and James developed routines and rhythms, learning to anticipate each other's needs and moods. They read aloud on long winter evenings, played cards and chess, and made love with a passion that surprised them both. James continued to write in his diary, but now the entries included Eleanor's voice as well, as she would sometimes add her own thoughts and observations to his pages. In the spring, they made plans for their future. James wanted to expand his horse breeding operation, and Eleanor suggested they could also raise cattle and sell beef to the growing mining towns. They worked together to clear more land, build a larger barn, and establish connections with potential buyers. Eleanor proved to have a sharp head for business, negotiating prices and contracts with a skill that impressed even the hardened ranchers and merchants they dealt with. As the years passed, their love deepened and matured. They faced challenges together, harsh winters, illness, the occasional visit from rustlers or drifters that required careful handling. But through it all, they remained each other's anchor and joy. James never stopped writing in his diary, documenting their life together with the same careful attention he had once devoted to watching her from afar. Eleanor would sometimes read his entries and marvel at how he noticed small details she had forgotten. The way she hummed while cooking, the expression on her face when she successfully broke a young horse to saddle, the tears in her eyes when they visited her grandmother's grave. In 1888, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas after James's father. James was terrified during the labor, pacing outside the bedroom while the midwife attended to Eleanor, and when he finally held his son for the first time, he wept with relief and joy. Eleanor recovered quickly, and they both threw themselves into parenthood with the same dedication they brought to everything else. Thomas was a healthy, curious baby who grew into a bright and energetic toddler, and James proved to be a patient and loving father. 2 years later, their daughter Margaret was born, named after Eleanor's grandmother. She had Eleanor's green eyes and James's dark hair, and from the beginning she was a force of nature, demanding attention and giving affection in equal measure. The cabin, which had once seemed spacious for two, now felt cozy and full with four, and James began plans to build an addition that would give the children their own room. Eleanor often thought about the diary pages that had led her to James, about the 20 years he had spent loving her from a distance, and she was grateful beyond words for her grandmother's wisdom in hiding those pages where she would find them. She could have lived her entire life never knowing that this kind of love existed, never experiencing the depth of connection she shared with James. Instead, she had taken a leap of faith, ridden into the mountains to confront a mysterious cowboy, and found her soulmate. As they sat on the porch one summer evening in 1892, watching Thomas and Margaret play in the yard, while the sun set behind the mountains, James reached over and took Eleanor's hand. "Do you remember the first day you arrived here? How uncertain everything was, how you did not know if I was someone to be trusted or feared." Eleanor smiled, squeezing his hand. "I remember being terrified and exhilarated at the same time. I remember thinking you might be either the answer to everything I had been searching for or the biggest mistake of my life." "And now?" James asked, though his eyes sparkled with the confidence of a man who already knew the answer. "Now I know you are the answer to everything," Eleanor said simply. "You are my partner, my love, my best friend. You are the father of my children and the keeper of my heart. Those 20 years you spent waiting, loving me from a distance, they were not wasted, James. They were preparation for this, for the life we have built together." James brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I would wait another 20 years, another lifetime, if it meant I could spend even one day as your husband. You are everything I ever dreamed of and more. You are my home, Eleanor." As darkness fell over the valley and they called the children inside for bed, Eleanor reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She thought about the diary pages that had changed everything, about the cowboy who had loved her with such devotion that he had documented it for 20 years, about the courage it had taken to ride into the mountains seeking answers. She thought about her grandmother who had orchestrated this reunion from beyond the grave, trusting that love would find a way. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. Thomas grew into a fine young man who shared his father's love of horses and his mother's head for business. Margaret developed a talent for drawing that rivaled her father's, and she filled sketchbooks with images of the valley and the family she loved. In 1895, Eleanor gave birth to another son, Daniel, who completed their family with his quiet wisdom and gentle humor. James never stopped writing in his diary, But now the entries were different. Instead of longing and distance, they were filled with gratitude and presence. He wrote about the feel of Eleanor's hand in his, about the sound of his children's laughter echoing through the valley, about the contentment of falling asleep each night beside the woman he had loved for so long. Eleanor occasionally added her own entries, documenting moments she wanted to remember. The first time Thomas successfully broke a horse to saddle, Margaret's first art exhibition in Helena, Daniel's birth during a snowstorm that had James delivering the baby himself when the midwife could not reach them in time. As they grew older together, their love did not diminish but rather transformed into something even more profound. They knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken, could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, and found joy in the simple pleasure of each other's company. They built a legacy not just in their children and their successful ranch, but in the example they set of what true partnership looked like. In 1905, on their 20th wedding anniversary, James presented Eleanor with a leather-bound book. Inside were all of his diary entries from those 20 years of loving her from a distance, carefully preserved and organized. "I want you to have these," he said. "I want our children and their children to know the story of how we came together. I want them to understand that real love is patient and enduring, that it sees beyond the surface to the soul beneath." Eleanor held the book to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "This is the most precious gift you could give me. Not because it documents your feelings, but because it shows what love really means. You loved me without possessing me, waited without demanding, and gave without expecting anything in return. That is the kind of love I want our children to seek in their own lives." They sat together on the porch of the cabin that had witnessed so much of their life, watching the sun set over the valley that had become their sanctuary. Their children were grown now, with lives and dreams of their own, but they still returned to the cabin regularly, drawn by the love and peace that permeated every board and stone. Thomas had married a school teacher from Helena and was building his own ranch in a neighboring valley. Margaret had moved to Denver to pursue her art, but visited every summer with her husband and infant daughter. Daniel, still unmarried at 19, helped his parents run the ranch and showed no inclination to leave. As the years passed, James and Eleanor became something of a legend in the territory. People spoke of the cowboy who had waited 20 years for love and the brave woman who had ridden into the mountains to find him. Their story was told and retold, embellished and romanticized, but those who knew them understood that the truth was more remarkable than any fiction. They had built a life based on genuine love, mutual respect, and unwavering commitment, and that foundation had allowed them to weather every storm. In 1915, James fell ill with pneumonia during a particularly harsh winter. Eleanor nursed him day and night, refusing to leave his side despite the urgings of their grown children. James recovered slowly, but the illness left him weakened, and both of them understood that their time together was growing shorter. Rather than being frightened by this realization, they embraced it, making the most of every moment. They took long walks through the valley, revisiting places that held special memories. They sat before the fire in the evenings, holding hands and reminiscing about their years together. James continued to sketch, now focusing on portraits of Eleanor, trying to capture the beauty he still saw in her aging face. Eleanor read aloud from books they both loved, her voice bringing comfort and joy to the man who had devoted his life to her. One spring evening in 1918, as they sat on the porch watching the first wildflowers bloom in the meadow, James turned to Eleanor with a serious expression. "I want you to promise me something. When I am gone, I want you to keep living fully. Do not shut yourself away or spend your remaining years grieving. Live with the same courage you showed when you rode into these mountains to find me. Promise me that." Eleanor shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "I cannot promise to not grieve you, James. You are my heart. But I can promise to honor the life we built together by continuing to live with purpose and joy. I can promise to share our story with our grandchildren and ensure they understand what real love looks like. I can promise to never regret a single moment of the life we chose." James pulled her close, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains they both loved. They had been given a gift that few people ever experienced, a love that transcended time and circumstance, a partnership built on genuine understanding and unwavering devotion. The diary pages that had brought them together had been just the beginning of a story that would continue to inspire generations. James lived another 7 years, passing peacefully in his sleep on a warm summer night in 1925. Eleanor held his hand as he drew his final breath, whispering words of love and gratitude. She mourned him deeply, but kept her promise, continuing to run the ranch with Daniel's help and remaining active in the lives of her children and grandchildren. She often returned to the diary pages, reading James's words and marveling at the extraordinary journey they had shared. Eleanor lived until 1935, reaching the age of 75. In her final days, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, she spoke about James and the love that had defined her life. She told them about the diary pages hidden under the floorboards, about riding into the mountains to find a mysterious cowboy, about discovering a love so profound it had sustained them through 5 decades of marriage. She made them promise to preserve James's diaries and to share the story with future generations. When Eleanor passed, she was buried beside James in a small cemetery overlooking the valley they had loved. Their children placed a single headstone for both of them, engraved with words that captured the essence of their relationship. He waited 20 years. She rode into the mountains. Together they built forever. The hidden cabin remained in the family, preserved as a testament to the power of patient love and courageous faith. And the diary pages, carefully protected in their leather-bound volume, became a family treasure, passed down through the generations as proof that real love, the kind that sees the soul before the surface, is worth waiting for.